The announcements regarding our meeting this afternoon have indicated that we're going to deal with questions and particularly questions regarding a book that has appeared this year. We're going to, of course, with the large crowd that we have, be unable to informally deal with the questions as perhaps we might have hoped. Each of us who are members of the White Estate staff who are here for a special prophetic guidance workshop are going to share in the presentation today. And we hope that as we share in this presentation that most of your questions will be answered. However, we're going to give opportunity for some of you who might want to personally ask some questions afterwards in a more informal way to stay afterwards a few moments perhaps as you have some questions. However, we don't want to be in competition with the program that is planned for 4:30. So we are planning to conclude our meeting prior to that time so that those who wish to be able to go to the other program can do so. And we hope that you will attend. We're very happy today to be with you and to share with you some things that I hope will be helpful to each of you as you consider some of the questions that have been raised in regard to a book that's been put into print in the last 2 or 3 months dealing with Ellen White as a prophetess of health. We have given some very careful study to this book and the content that it has. We have looked very carefully at the various considerations that have been made in this book. And over the past several months, we've given this careful attention and thought to the material that's there. And we feel that we have something to present today that will be of help to perhaps most, if not all of you, in dealing with the questions that have been raised. The three of us are going to participate in the program today. Dr. Robert Olson, who is an Associate Secretary of the White Estate, is going to lead out in our discussion. Elder Delafield, who is also an Associate Secretary, will follow him with brief thoughts in a certain area, and I'll conclude in our afternoon's presentation. We hope and trust and pray that what we say today will be of help and blessing to each of you. And may the Lord bless us as we worship together today in this very special meeting dealing with Ellen White in her role as a prophet of health. At this time, I want to ask Dr. Olson to come forward and bring our major presentation regarding this book and the questions it raises, and the rest of us will follow without further announcement.
Thank you, Paul. The brethren have asked me to take until 10 minutes till 4, and then they will have about 10 minutes each. So the plan is to close about 4:10, and I trust, or maybe 4:15. I trust this will allow plenty of time to get over to the church for the 4:30 hour. And as Elder Gordon has said, if there are still remaining puzzles in anybody's mind, I'll be glad to stay right here just as long as anybody wants to talk. But that will be on an informal basis, not a meeting like we have now. First, a little of the background of this book. It has suddenly been thrust into national prominence by this Time magazine article. How many of you are familiar with this article? Could I see your hands? Well, I think that's just about 100%. Someone told me yesterday there wasn't a Time magazine for sale within 50 miles of Berrien Springs. It's all been bought up. And even at that, the Xerox machines have been kept busy also. One of the ministers attending our workshop, we have the prophetic guidance workshop going on right now. That's what brings us here. We didn't come to Berrien Springs just for this hour. We're here for 2 weeks for a prophetic guidance workshop. And one of the ministers who is in attendance told me that until just a few weeks ago, he had never heard of this book, didn't know anything about it. So it has not had a great deal of advertising. Of course, it only was published about the 1st of May, so it's quite recent. But now, with the Time magazine article, why, everybody is going to be talking about it, I'm sure, in our church and many outside of the church. Well, how did this book come about, and who is the author? I think probably that many of you here know a little more about the author than those of our people in most of the country, inasmuch as Dr. Numbers was, I'm told, a member of the faculty here at one time. Is that right? And that was until maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And then he went to Loma Linda University, where he was a member of the Department of Humanities. He taught the history of medicine to the medical students, and he was with the Loma Linda University till June 30, 1974. That's about 2 years ago now. So he's been with the University of Wisconsin at Madison since that time, and he's teaching again in their history department. Dr. Numbers approached the members of the White Estate, the officers there, 1972, inquiring if he could come back and do some research. He was planning this book. He was a professor at the Loma Linda University, and as far as anyone knew, he had the best of intentions in mind. And so the White Estate treated him like they will treat any teacher in any of our colleges or universities. They opened up their files to him, did everything they could to help him. In fact, he was granted some privileges that most researchers are not granted. Most who come are not allowed to just browse. They have to check the index cards, find the references they want, and then they're supplied with the letters or manuscripts that are called for. But Dr. Numbers was allowed to take drawers from the files and just browse through looking for what he wanted. So he really was helped in every way possible, even given special privileges. After a while, those who were working with him and seeing some of the requests that he made became aware of the fact that the work that he planned to produce would have a negative tone in it as far as Ellen White was concerned. And he also informed Elder White that he did not plan to submit his work to an Adventist publisher, but he would have it published outside. And of course, this did cause some apprehension, because normally there would be no reason why one of our men wouldn't want an Adventist publisher to publish his book. At any rate, this is the route that it took. In September of 1974, Dr. Numbers sent a copy of his manuscript to Harper and Row in New York City, and at the same time, in the same mail, sent a copy to Elder White at the White Estate. After some correspondence, it became evident that Harper and Row were anxious that we would make any input that we felt like making into this book. They gave us several months to do research, and we gave Dr. Numbers a 228-page critique in which we listed many, many places where we felt his work was erroneous. Either the use of the facts was wrong, or else it was not factual at all. These criticisms were presented to him personally in February 1975 by Dr. Richard Schwartz of this university and Elder Ron Graybill. These two men met with Dr. Numbers in Madison, Wisconsin. They went over these criticisms together. Now, Dr. Numbers has not accepted all of our suggestions, and we feel that his book, because of this, does not reflect an image of Ellen White, which it really ought to if it's to tell a true, accurate story. I would like, for my part this afternoon, to mention 4 different procedures that Dr. Numbers has used in his book, all of which are unsatisfactory to me. Now, my main motive in speaking is to ask everyone who is here, and anybody who might hear this discussion on a cassette later, to please not form your opinion of Ellen White on the basis of this book alone, because it is not a satisfactory or a correct picture. Please do other reading. Read books that have been written about her by those at the White Estate, published by our own church, or her own books also. Dr. Numbers states in the introduction, or the preface to his book, page 11, He says, this, I believe, is the first book about her that seeks neither to defend nor to damn, but simply to understand. So he's not trying to defend and not trying to damn. He says, I have tried to be as objective as possible. And I would like to illustrate through these 4 different procedures he has used that he has not been objective. Now, I admit that it's impossible for anyone to be objective. I think whoever writes on any subject, pure objectivity is impossible. But I feel that Dr. Numbers hasn't really come as close as he could have. He says, I have refrained from using divine inspiration as an historical explanation. Now, in order not to use divine inspiration as an explanation, the author of the book has sometimes really misstated the facts in order to give it a natural explanation. I now want to give you some details. The first of these 4 procedures is a misstatement of fact. On page 19 of this book, the author refers to Ellen White's visions. He says, according to the testimony of numerous physicians and curiosity seekers, her vital functions slowed alarmingly, with her heart beating sluggishly and respiration becoming imperceptible. Now, there is no record that anyone has left that her heart beat sluggishly while she was having a vision, or that her vital functions slowed alarmingly. Those are not factual phrases. He says her respiration became imperceptible. Now, what does the word imperceptible mean? It means she was breathing, but you just couldn't tell it. What are the facts? According to those who examined her, and she was examined many, many times in vision, including Merritt Kellogg, who is one of the individuals referred to as an authority on this point by Dr. Numbers. Merritt Kellogg is quoted from something he said about, or his brother actually said about 1906, but Merritt Kellogg now was sympathetic with John Harvey Kellogg. Merritt was 74 years of age, was dependent on his brother, John Harvey, financially. And many years earlier, Merritt Kellogg had witnessed Ellen White in vision. When he was 21 years old, 1853, he saw her in vision. And he says this in the book Messenger to the Remnant, page 22. I am quite certain that she did not breathe at that time while in vision, nor in any of several others which she has had when I was present. Now, there is a testimony of Dr. Merritt Kellogg. And then Elder George I. Butler. While she is in vision, her breathing entirely ceases. No breath ever escapes her nostrils or lips when in this condition. This has been proved by many witnesses, among them physicians of skill, and themselves unbelievers in the visions, on some occasions being appointed by a public congregation for the purpose. It has been proved many times by tightly holding the nostrils and mouth with the hand and by putting a looking glass before them. Not the slightest breath escapes. So these are the facts. And the author of the book has misstated the facts because he wishes to give a naturalistic explanation. He says he will not give divine intervention as an explanation, and that leads him to twist these facts. He uses the word imperceptible for her breathing. That's one point. Now, here's another. On page 129, the author has 2 quotations at the beginning of the chapter. God would not have his people adopt the so-called reform dress, and God would now have his people adopt the reform dress. The emphasis that Dr. Numbers wishes us to get is what I have just given. That in 1863 she says, no, he won't do it. And in 1867 he says, all right, now he will. In other words, Ellen White changed her mind. And the story that is given here in the book is that she did this because of the influence of Dr. Jackson's institution at Dansville, New York. Ellen White visited there September 1864, about 15 months after her health reform vision of June 1863. And so the author pictures her as being influenced, you see, by Dr. Jackson, that she didn't advocate the reform dress because of what the Lord said, but because of the ideas she picked up in New York, Dansville, New York. And so God would not have his people 1863, God would now have his people 1867. She's got the ideas from Dr. Jackson. And this is the way that it's presented in the chapter. Actually, this is a misstatement of fact, and it will only be caught by the most careful reader. Let me read these sentences again with a different emphasis. God would not have his people adopt the so-called reform dress, 1863. God would now have his people adopt the reform dress, 1867. The so-called reform dress was not ever to be adopted at any time. Mrs. White always used those phrases separately. The expression so-called reform dress always she applied to the dress that Amelia Bloomer and Harriet Austin and others had developed. This was the one, the American costume. It was the one that was in use there at Jackson's Institution, Dansville, New York. And when Ellen White saw this, there were certain features about it that she didn't like. She called the dress that she developed, which was in harmony with what God had shown her in vision, she called that the reform dress. She always maintained this difference in terminology. And the author of this book always confuses those terms. And it makes Ellen White appear dependent on others for ideas. So it is a misstatement of fact. Another illustration on page 136, again about the dress. The author has a whole chapter dealing with this, called Short Skirts and Sex. Page 136. The dress should reach somewhat below the top of the boot, she said. And a little earlier, alert readers were not slow in pointing out that the top of the boot was a good deal higher than an inch or two from the street. A little earlier, she had made a different statement. It was to be an inch or two, and Dr. Numbers has stopped the quotation at that point and that added from the street in his own words. But this is a misstatement of fact. You get the idea from reading it that Ellen White once said the dress should be an inch or two from the street, and she never said that. Now she says the dress should be about the top of the boot. And so he is indicating that she is just contradicting herself. Now she's giving one idea near the top of the boot. Earlier she said an inch or two from the street. What did she say earlier? She never said an inch or two from the street. Here's what she said. Volume 1 of the Testimonies, page 424. If women would wear their dresses so as to clear the filth of the streets an inch or two, their dresses would be modest. Now, to clear the filth of the street an inch or two is a lot different from being an inch or two from the street. Remember, in those days, there were no paved roads like we have now. The streets were not clean at all. There was a lot of mud. And more than that, the conveyances that were most generally used were horse-drawn. And you can fill in the rest of the picture from that. I am told that the streets of the city of New York had to be cleaned every night. And so when Ellen White said that the dress should be high enough from the ground so it would clear the filth of the street an inch or two, that's saying about the same thing as that it should reach near the top of the boot. But the author does not make this clear, and he makes it appear. He goes out of his way to give the idea that Ellen White is contradicting herself. On page 152, he says something about masturbation, and this was picked up by the author of the article in Time magazine. And again, it's a misstatement of fact. I don't know how many of you are aware of this. Here is what we read in the book. Everywhere I looked, she recalled with obvious horror, I saw imbecility, dwarf forms, crippled limbs, misshapen heads, and deformity of every description. Thus far, this is accurate. And then the author says, sickened by the sight before her, she learned that it had resulted from the practice of solitary vice. That's masturbation. Secret sin, it was called. Now, this statement appears in her little booklet entitled Appeal to Mothers, and it basically was on secret sin or masturbation. But if the whole sentence or the whole section of that paragraph had been quoted in its context, why, you get a completely different idea. Let me read it to you. Now, here is what she wrote. I'm quoting from Appeal to Mothers, page 17. Everywhere I looked, I saw imbecility, dwarf forms, crippled limbs, misshapen heads, and deformity of every description. Sins, and here's the next sentence, which Dr. Numbers omits. Sins and crimes and the violation of nature's laws were shown me as the causes of this accumulation of human woe and suffering. Now, does she blame all of this, the misshapen heads and so on masturbation? Not at all. She enlarged on this concept a year later. What I've quoted to you was written in 1864. In 1865, she published this. Physicians, by administering their drug poisons, have done very much to increase the depreciation of the race physically, mentally, and morally. Everywhere you may go, you will see deformity, disease, and imbecility, which in very many cases can be traced directly back to drug poisons. So here she's even introducing drug poisons. And if you've ever heard about thalidomide and the tragedy of 15 years ago, you'll know that there really is a connection between misshapen heads and so on and drugs. Now, it is clear that Ellen White did relate imbecility to masturbation. That she did. But not all the misshapen heads and so on. Another point on page 157. This is about sex. And this is an area that hits everybody right in his solar plexus because it's such a delicate issue. If you think somebody is anti-sex, you just tune them out right away. At least most people are this way. And so the author of this book, in discussing Mrs. White's sexual attitudes, really should have, I think, bent over backward to be fair about it. But in fact, he was not. He misstated the facts. Page 157, although she, Ellen White, never defined exactly what she meant by excessive sex in marriage, it seems likely, since she generally agreed with earlier health reformers in such matters, that she would have frowned on having intercourse more frequently than once a month. That was the maximum Sylvester Graham had condoned, and his disciple O.S. Fowler, who personally favored sex for procreation only, had stated to indulge even in wedlock, as often as the moon quarters is gradual but effectual destruction of both soul and body. Now, I know that this is such a sensitive matter that we need to talk about it with a certain amount of reverence. I don't want to be light in what I say. But I am here this afternoon to defend Ellen White. And therefore I feel I must tell you what I'm going to. The author has misrepresented not only Ellen White, but also Sylvester Graham and Dr. Fowler. I feel that I should tell you what these men have said. Graham wrote, I'll quote it for you, I think I have it right here. Yes, here we are. Graham wrote this. You see, Dr. Numbers says Graham favored once a month and Ellen White just copied him and everything, so she probably would have copied him in this. Here are Graham's words. It is therefore impossible to lay down a precise rule which will be equally adapted to all men in regard to the frequency of their connubial commerce. It's a nice way of speaking about it. But as a general rule, it may be said to the healthy and robust, It were better for you not to exceed in the frequency of your indulgences the number of months in the year, and you cannot exceed the number of weeks in the year without impairing your constitutional powers, shortening your lives, and increasing your liability to disease and suffering. So you've heard now what Sylvester Graham said, and I feel that this is a misstatement of fact to say that Graham has said once a month, and then of course Ellen White just copied him, so that's what she would have done. Mrs. White speaks against excessive sex in marriage, but she never at any time defines what she means by that. People differ, and because of this, I'm sure she would have felt that that was inappropriate. And so it is wrong, really, for somebody to decide for her what she meant by this word excessive. It is a misstatement of fact. Now, there's another point on sex. He pictures Ellen White as antipathetic towards sex. That's the word he uses. Throughout her long life, Ellen White remained generally antipathetic towards sex. In her waning years, she looked forward expectantly to an idyllic existence in the new earth free from such unpleasant activities. When some members inquired in 1904 if there would be any children born in the next life, she replied sharply that Satan had inspired the question. It was he, she said, who was leading, quotes, the imagination of Jehovah's Watchmen to dwell upon the possibilities of association in the world to come with women whom they love and of their raising families, unquotes. As for herself, she needed no such prospects. Now, this is a misstatement of fact. He quotes Ellen White correctly, but he puts it all together where it doesn't belong. She is writing to Elder E.J. Wagner, who's in love with another woman other than his wife. And he and his girlfriend had decided they would get married in heaven and have their family there because they couldn't get married here. He was already... So when Mrs. White writes against this idea of dreaming about the time when you will be married to this woman you love in heaven, what she is saying is not get sex out of your mind. She's saying to Elder Wagner, get that woman out of your mind. That's what she is saying. And that's altogether different. And I call this a misstatement of fact. And for these reasons and more, it is unsafe to form an opinion of Ellen White by the reading of this book. The author has not been fair to her. Another point that is mentioned in the article that came out just this week in the Time magazine, I see we have a copy of it right here. Here's Dr. Kellogg is referred to. Says, though official Adventist historians say the records are ambiguous, now the Time magazine writer is incorrect there, because our historians do not say that the records are ambiguous in the point he's bringing up. We say the records are clear as can be. At any rate, though official Adventist historians say the records are ambiguous, Numbers states that Kellogg offered his church the patent rights to wheat flakes and corn flakes, which would have made it fabulously wealthy. But White rejected the idea as tying up too much time and talent in manufacturing mere temporal foods. Now, what are the facts? Did John Harvey Kellogg ever offer wheat flakes and corn flakes to the Seventh-day Adventist Church? If you will look in the back of Numbers book, I think it's on page 254, he gives as a credit reference for this statement, and Time magazine has quoted him on this. Here's the credit reference for that Kellogg made the offer, is John Harvey Kellogg to Ellen G. White, June 10, 1896. So let's look at that letter. What did John Harvey Kellogg write to Ellen White on that day? Here it is. I have a number of new foods and shall try to make some arrangements to have them manufactured abroad. Our people might just as well take up this food business and make money out of it to support the entire denominational work, if they would only appreciate it. But they do not. And I am so busy that I can do but very little in the way of pushing it. Is that an offer of the wheat flakes or the corn flakes to our people? No. Kellogg is just complaining to Ellen White that our people don't have an appreciation for it. That's all. He never made it an offer, and it was never understood as an offer. And 10 years later, when he was interested in getting some of our representatives on the West Coast at the St. Helena Sanitarium Health Food Company to manufacture and sell his products, he specifically stated that there would only be one condition on which he would work with them, and that is if the arrangement would have nothing whatsoever to do with the church. Willie White wrote a letter to A.G. Daniels on September 20, 1906, and it was right after a committee meeting had been held as to whether we in the West Coast, the Sanitarium Health Food Company at St. Helena, whether we would be able to manufacture and sell the cornflakes. During this conference between our two men and Dr. Kellogg, W.C. White is writing, during this conference they were fully satisfied, our two men were satisfied, that it is the intention of the doctor and W.K. to establish a factory on this coast, California, and to separate their work from our denominational food business. They refused to consider any plan by which the cornflakes should be manufactured by the St. Helena Sanitarium Food Company. Their principal reason was their utter lack of confidence in any business enterprise connected with the denomination. So, there was never any offer made at any time. And to state that Ellen White is responsible for turning down millions and millions of dollars that could have come to our church when it was offered to us is certainly to misstate the facts. Well, I have only 10 minutes left, and I still have 3 points to go. The second of my 4 points is insinuations of dishonesty. The author never comes out. He never comes out clearly and says Ellen White lied. But he comes as close as he can without making that statement. Now here's page 32. She said in 1849 about going to doctors, "If any among us are sick, let us not dishonor God by applying to earthly physicians, but apply to the God of Israel." Now listen carefully. Does she ever say that we are never to go to physicians? She never made a statement like that in her lifetime. And the author of this book says she does. And this is the statement that he credits that to. "If any among us are sick, let us not dishonor God by applying to earthly physicians, but apply to the God of Israel. Go to the Lord, ask for healing. If we follow his directions, the sick will be healed. God's promise cannot fail. Have faith in God and trust wholly in him, that when Christ, who is our life, shall appear, we may appear with him in glory." That's page 32. Now on page 35, the author refers to that as the admonition from her 1849 broadside never to apply to earthly physicians. Now in 1854, she went to a physician herself. She had cancerous growth of some kind on her eye. She prayed and asked the Lord to heal this thing, and it was not healed. And so she went to a doctor, showing she was quite willing to go if prayers were not answered. And the doctor wasn't able to help her, so she went back to the Lord, and it was healed. Now in 1860, she wrote this: "We believe in the prayer of faith, but some have carried this matter too far, especially those who have been affected with fanaticism. Some have taken the strong ground that it was wrong to use simple remedies. We've never taken this position, but have opposed it. We believe it to be perfectly right to use the remedies God has placed in our reach, and if these fail, apply to the great physician. And in some cases, the counsel of an earthly physician is very necessary. This position we have always held." Now here is what Dr. Numbers follows that quotation with. I say there are insinuations that Ellen White was dishonest. He follows that with this: "In view of her counsel just 11 years earlier, the last sentence of this statement is puzzling." Just an insinuation, you see. Now, he says he's not going to defend or damn Ellen White. But the author of this article in Time magazine, in reading the book, felt that it was a challenge. He says, belief in White is divinely inspired, a tenet for Adventists since her death in 1915, is now under scrutiny. That's what he says. It's the divine inspiration is under scrutiny. And this, of course, is what the book amounts to. Page 95, another illustration of this hinting that Ellen White was less than candid. It seems that she shared with Sylvester Graham and others a reluctance to acknowledge her intellectual and literary debts. Now, there were people who were using the language and the phraseology in the works of others all the time. He even says she shared with Sylvester Graham and others. They were all doing this. A reluctance to acknowledge her intellectual and literary debts. Now, John Wesley, when he wrote his commentaries, you can read the statement I'm referring to now in Ellen G. White and Her Critics, page 406. F.T. Nicholas put it there. John Wesley says, I thought for a while that I would give credit to everybody whose language I used, because I had really taken some just word for word in writing his own commentaries. But then he said, I decided not to, because I wanted the readers to get the message that I was writing and not be distracted by all these notes and credit lines. And so Wesley did that, others did it, and it really is not quite fair to expect of writers, other health writers as well as Ellen White, 100 years ago, to expect them to use the standards of scholarship that we find quite commonplace today. So there's this insinuation she was dishonest, you see, when she felt free to use the language of others. A third of these four procedures that he used, first is misstatement of fact. I'm leaving out quite a few illustrations. There are many more in the book that I could give you, but simply for limitation of time, I have to leave a lot of this out. But the first procedure was misstatement of fact. Second is insinuations of dishonesty. Third is belittlement. Now, the author says he's not damning and he's not defending. But throughout the book, there is an intentional belittlement of James White, of Ellen White, and of the work that they're doing, the people who work with them. I'll just give one illustration of this. It's not a very nice one, but I do want to call your attention to it. Page 146. Ellen White had the vision on dress reform with the other health measures. She had done her best to try to persuade our sisters to become reformers in this matter, but had not been successful. It had become a divisive issue, and so the Lord instructed her that this should not be pressed, should not be made a point of division. And Ellen White wrote from the first that it was only one of the minor points in the whole message of reform. And so the author of this book now mentions the point when it is no longer to be pressed in this way. The testimony calling for the dress reform adoption was now to become silent. Journeying to California, Mrs. White discreetly left her pants behind. The ordeal was over. Now, I want to ask you, is that a nice way to write about a lady, whether she's a prophet or not? This is an illustration, it's not the only one, of the author's attempt to belittle the subject of his book. Has he been objective in doing this? There's a fourth point, and that is the omission of contrary evidence. The author often could give a different picture if he would only introduce a little more evidence. We supplied him with plenty of this in our 228-page critique that we gave him in February of last year. I'll give you just two illustrations. On page 176 of this book, Dr. Numbers says, Dr. Kellogg made a point of supplying the prophetess with the latest data from his laboratories and apprising her of developments in medicine and nutrition. Now, there's not one letter that we have in our vault that indicates that Dr. Kellogg ever did this kind of thing, that he ever supplied her with this health information. Nor is there a letter from Ellen White acknowledging such a thing in writing to him. Now, I say the omission of contrary evidence. In the manuscript that we went over, that Dr. Numbers sent to us in September of '74, there was something that is not now in his book, and I feel I should tell you about it. He said in that manuscript, and I will not quote, I'll just tell you what it was. He said that in 1904, Dr. Kellogg described to Ellen White the process of sterilization of milk and explained to her why this was necessary. And then he said in 1905, she published Ministry of Healing and said milk should be sterilized, indicating she got the idea from Dr. Kellogg, not from the Lord, but just from others. And then he said something like this in that manuscript: how many times this kind of thing happened we'll probably never know. Now, we pointed out to him in our critique that Ellen White was the one who had said it first, not Dr. Kellogg. She wrote, and I think I have this here, she wrote in 1901, 3 years before Kellogg's first mention of it, the milk used should be procured from healthy cows and should be sterilized. That's Counsels in Diet and Food, page 203, written in 1901. In fact, in 1896, 8 years before Dr. Kellogg's statement about it, she said, I use a little boiled milk in my simple homemade coffee. Now, we asked Dr. Numbers, at least we implied in our critique, that if his argument was that the former writer influenced the latter, then it would be proper, wouldn't it, to please give Ellen White the credit for influencing Dr. Kellogg. But this kind of thing, you see, did not fit into his scheme, because the scheme of his book is to show that Ellen White was influenced by others. And so that whole thing is lifted right out. You don't read about that in this book. Now, I call this his fourth procedure, which is the omission of contrary evidence. And you can teach a lot of things if you want to just omit everything that's contrary. I'll give you one more illustration of that. It's already time for me to close. And that is this. On page 174, the author states that Mrs. White changed the reason in her later years that she gave our people for not using flesh food. In early years, she said you should not eat it because it strengthens your animal propensities and because it's diseased. And then in later years, because of the influence of a Catholic lady in Australia, she then changed her emphasis and said you shouldn't eat meat because look what it does to the animals. Let's be sympathetic to these poor creatures. And that was now her stress, because in her old age she had become a little bit more sympathetic to the animal kingdom. Now, we pointed out to him that this was not the case, and his bringing out the 1905 statement in Ministry of Healing, which seemed to support his thesis, this was not the last thing she said about it at all. And after her Ministry of Healing statement, where she does mention the matter of being kind to animals, and she also mentions the disease condition of meat, after that, she still made what I consider to be the most important pronouncement she ever made on the non-use of flesh food. And this was a manuscript that she prepared and she personally read at the General Conference in 1909 in Washington, D.C. It was the last General Conference that she ever attended. In Volume 9 of the Testimonies, you read this. It's all printed there. On page 159 of this book, she gave reasons why we should not use flesh food. And they're just the same as she was giving in the 1860s. She did not change through the years. Here's Volume 9, 159. I have been instructed that flesh food has a tendency to animalize the nature. Now, she's reading this before all the thousands of people, however many were there, in Washington, D.C. Flesh food has a tendency to animalize the nature, to rob men and women of that love and sympathy which they should feel for everyone, and to give the lower passions control over the higher powers of the being. If meat eating was ever healthful, it is not safe now, and so on. We pointed this out to the author, but he refused to use it because it does not fit in his thesis of Ellen White being influenced by others, like that Catholic lady is supposed to have changed her emphasis, but it didn't. Now, these are the 4 points that I wish to mention, and I want to review them. I won't give any more illustrations. First of these procedures, there is a misstatement of fact. Secondly, there are insinuations of dishonesty. Thirdly, there is a belittlement of Ellen White and others in the church. Fourthly, there is frequent omission of contrary evidence. I ask you, has the author of the book been objective? He says, I have tried to be as objective as possible. I somehow don't feel he has tried very hard. And so I would urge everyone who listens to this tape or who's listening to our discussion this afternoon, please do not form your opinion of Ellen G. White on the basis of that book alone. Now there are 2 others who are to speak, and I have robbed my brethren of 5 minutes of time, for which I apologize, but maybe we can go to 4:15 instead of 4:10. Elder Delafield, you have a part of this topic that you're going to present, and I believe Elder Delafield is going to discuss the parallel passages.
Well, I want to come right to the point and say that Dr. Olson has defended Ellen White, but please remember the individual whom he has defended is not a god. We do not have an Ellen G. White cult in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We worship God, we do not worship a human being. And Mrs. White was just a human being, one who never claimed infallibility, that is, as a person or for her character. She did state clearly that her writings, that is, what she wrote, the language that she used, was her own. And only as she wrote and the angels spoke did she put those words in marks of quotation. We do not attempt to defend Ellen G. White as a god. We do not even call her our leader, as the Christian Scientists refer to Mary Baker Eddy, or as the Mormons might to Joseph Smith. She was a mother in Israel, a humble human being, who in her own personal life may have made mistakes in judgments, as indeed she did. But we do regard the fact that the God who inspired her was an infallible God, and that the views that he gave to her came from an infallible source, and that she was indeed enlightened on these health topics, as on theology and other points, by that God. And she had to take those ideas and embody them in human language. Human language is fallible, and therefore at that point we must recognize that the language she used here and there could have been expressed perhaps in a better way. So we do not worship this dedicated woman. We regard her as a human being, but as one who had a gift, the gift of prophecy, and who was inspired by God. Now, the reason why we are concerned about this book and why we consider it to be unfortunate is that this book presents an alternative to the view held by Seventh-day Adventists that Mrs. White was indeed inspired by God and that she was instructed by the Lord in visions and dreams as the Bible prophets were centuries before. If it is true, as the author of this book says, that Mrs. White's writings can be explained purely on a naturalistic basis and by natural causes, then it is wrong for Seventh-day Adventists, as we have done for over a century, to attribute to Mrs. White's writings a supernatural origin. And if it is true, as this author says, that she was merely a product of her times, an alert woman who saw in the health teachings of her contemporaries, that is, men like Cole, men like Horace Mann, Dr. Jackson, Dr. Trawl, and others, ideas and language that she could popularize in her own written messages, then what Mrs. White says about the origin of these health teachings is false. And if it is false, Ellen G. White is a liar, and she is more than a liar. She is indeed, in verity, a thief, a literary thief, or a plagiarist. Now, what did she say about these health writings? She said that she got her ideas from the Lord in a great health reform vision that God gave to her, in the home of Aaron Hilliard in Otsego, Michigan, on a Friday evening, June 5. It's attributed to June 6 of the year 1863. I quote from the review of October 8, 1867. It was June 6, 1863, that the great subject of health reform was opened before me in vision. Now, as soon as this light came to her in vision, in private conversations and in meetings, she began to advocate what the Lord had given to her by divine revelation. And what happened? She spoke to her friends against drugs, against flesh meats, in favor of water, pure air, and proper diet. And her friends would ask her, after they heard her speak, if she had read the paper Laws of Life or read the books of Troll, Jackson, and others. And now I quote Mrs. White, listen, my reply was that I had not, neither should I read them till I had fully written out my views. Now that is what she said. Did she lie? Was she stating the facts, or was she misrepresenting the facts? No. All right. When then did she publish her views? And did she publish them prior to the time when she read what her contemporary health reformers said? And the answer is that she published them in August 1864, prior to reading what they wrote, not afterwards. Now let me quote to you a statement here from her pen. I did not read any works on health until I had written Spiritual Gifts, Volume 4, Appeal to Mothers, and had sketched out most of my 6 articles in the 6 numbers of How to Live. And after I had written my 6 articles for How to Live, I then searched the various works on hygiene and was surprised to find them so nearly in harmony with what the Lord had revealed to me. So the light she got in the vision of June 6, 1863 appeared in August in the book Spiritual Gifts, Volume 4. After that was done, she then began to plan 6 articles dealing with the same theme. And then, as she began to plan these articles, Mrs. White began to read what these men had written. And when the book How to Live came out, which contained her 6 articles and articles by her contemporaries, she did this in order to show how nearly what God had revealed to her in vision corresponded, how nearly what they said agreed with what she had received in her vision. Now, Round Numbers makes reference to the Spiritual Gifts, Volume 4 article on health, and states that she plagiarized there in a book that she said she wrote before she read their views. And there are several places there where the language is similar. Why not? If at that time these health reformers had discovered truth concerning physical health, why couldn't the God of heaven reveal the same truths to a prophet as had come by research to the scientist? And if the prophet should indeed use similar language in explaining the same ideas, why should it be thought that she plagiarized from the scientists who were her contemporaries? The language of the time was similar, and there was not an exact quotation, but there were similar words used. God expresses truth not only through a prophet, he may also do so through a scientist. But take a look at the 4 exhibits, the 4 parallel exhibits in Spiritual Gifts, Volume 4, and what do you find? You find as you look at these that 3 of those 4 exhibits used by the author of this book represent what Ellen White wrote on the subject of tea, coffee, and tobacco. And she had received light on these subjects in vision as early as 1848, as early as 1854 in 2 visions, and then in the June 6, 1863 vision. And in the other instance to which I refer, it is obvious that one would have to stretch the imagination a great deal to be able to call it an actual plagiarizing statement or something that she actually copied from Dr. Cole, as this author suggests. Now later on, if Mrs. White, after she'd studied what they said, should incorporate into her writings, as indeed she did, the very language of these authors, why should this be challenged when, as Dr. Olson has indicated, that this was a very common practice in those times? This then, to me, is a very important historical consideration, and when the facts are known, you see that Ellen White's claim that she got her views on health from God and that those views came through vision are indeed substantiated, whereas the author's accusations that it was merely a matter of natural causes are indeed untrue. The reason why this is of great concern to Adventists is this: if Mrs. White got her health views from contemporary health sources and not from God in vision, then why not go a step farther and state that she got her views on theology from contemporary theologians? And why not say, therefore, that she got her views on education from contemporary educators? And on and on and on. And if this is indeed so, then we don't have a prophet anymore. What do we have? We have an individual who has boasted of the prophetic gift, who is nothing more than a liar and a fraud. And if that is true, then what are you going to do with the 63 books from the pen of Ellen White today? You're going to have to discard them as unreliable, as products of pure human origin. And I, for one, my dear friends, am not about to do that. How about you? Amen. I refuse to accept this alternative to Ellen White, this purely naturalistic basis for her writings. The proof is on the side of truth always. And the truth of the matter is, as our pamphlets will develop as you read them, and the true historical pattern is given, that Mrs. Ellen G. White was indeed just exactly what she claimed to be. Well, there's much more that all of us could say, and we're trying to rush through these things because we're fighting time. But now we turn to Elder Paul Gordon, an Associate Secretary of the Ellen G. White Estate, and he wishes to develop another aspect of this whole question. Elder Gordon.
There have been historically 4 basic attacks upon prophets. It's been suggested that the prophet's message is from Satan, or that it's part from God and part from Satan, or that it's the prophet's opinion only, or that it's from contemporaries. And we find that Christ himself, as well as several of the Bible prophets, were objects of such criticism. You'll recall that Christ was accused of healing by the power of Beelzebub, or the devil. That Jeremiah was accused of getting his information from someone else and not really from God. And so really the charges, the criticisms of the modern messenger are not new ones. We might say these 4 charges in another way, that first of all they may say that it's satanic, that is, they would accept that it's miraculous but not miraculous from God, or that it's mixed, that is to say I can choose which is from God or which is from the devil. And that of course puts the final judgment as to what is really from God or from the devil upon the person who reads, which by the way is not an uncommon method today. Or that it's human, that is, only a human fabrication. Or as suggested, I think, largely in the book that we're considering under discussion today, borrowed. That is to say, I claim as a prophet that God told me, but really I'm lying. Now, these are serious contentions, obviously, and we've considered them briefly today. Certainly the book that we have under consideration gives the overall impression that Ellen White was a clever and shrewd and designing woman who freely stole or pirated concepts and ideas from others and then claimed they were her own. You know, it's never been easy to be a prophet, because when you come claiming that God has spoken through you, you sometimes have to tell people things they don't want to hear. Isn't that right? In fact, as I discover the work of the prophet, I find that the prophet's work was far and away a work of reform, a call for change, a call for a way of life that was different than what was being practiced at the time the prophet's message came. Ellen White's work called for major reforms in several areas, a drastic change in lifestyle, if you please. You stop and think of what was advocated: a change in food and drink, dress, a day of worship, recreation, use of money, relation to government, labor unions, the school system, and personal witness, only to mention a few. There was a call for an ambitious world work as a church, with schools and hospitals and missions and medical work and publishing work. And these calls came to a group that numbered only in the hundreds in the beginning. James White, as he referred to Ellen White's call and her work as a prophet, reminds us of the fact that it was never easy to be a reformer. And in fact, as we read of his account that appeared in the Review and Herald of March 17, 1868, we perhaps notice with a little bit of a smile on our face just how he stated it. Talking of his wife's work, he said, "She works to this advantage, namely, she makes strong appeals to the people which a few feel deeply and take strong positions and go to extremes. Then, to save the cause from ruin, in consequence of these extremes, she is obliged to come out with reproofs for extremists in a public manner. This is better than to have things go to pieces, but the influence of both the extremes and the reproofs are terrible on the cause and bring upon Mrs. White a threefold burden. Here's the difficulty," he says. "What she may say to urge the tardy is taken by the prompt to urge them over the mark. And what she may say to caution the prompt, zealous, incautious ones is taken by the tardy as an excuse to remain too far behind." Now, isn't that the truth? He goes on in this article, and by the way, it's a very interesting one. You'll find it in the book that we have in our White Estate office, Notes and Papers. He goes on to say this: "We protest against the plan practically taught by some, cure or kill." He's talking about health reform. "And give a dose accordingly." You know, some people practice health reform even if it kills them, or at least some kind of health reform. He says, "Some sores need help in their cure, others will work their own cure best. It takes time to reform a poor, sinful, intemperate, blind, stubborn piece of humanity." You know, James White said it pretty straight. He says it's a large job. "And those who come a good way short of the faith of Abraham and the patience of Job had better lay out a little more time and toil on their own case before going to work for others." I think that's a beautiful statement. It reminds us that it wasn't easy to be a reformer. Certainly not in the area that we have to deal with 3 times a day or twice a day, whatever the case may be. That is the eating of food and, of course, other things related. You know, when Ellen White received this vision in 1863, she was a mother of age 37. She had 3 sons. She was traveling, she was speaking, she was writing, she was a wife of a man who was soon to become the administrator of the church. She only had an average knowledge of nutrition and health. The vision was new. It brought something to her in some ways that was contrary to her own practice and her own ideas. You know, one of the excellent sources, by the way, that you ought to look to for guidance in this area is a little book that's been around for more than 30 years. A book entitled The Story of Our Health Message by D.E. Robinson. If you haven't gotten this book, by all means read it and read it carefully, because really this book answers the one that's in print today that's just come out. And it's been around for more than 30 years. But in this particular setting, Ellen White talks about her visions, and we've referred to them just briefly, but particularly the vision in regard to what the Lord had shown her. She says, I was surprised to find what she had heard in her vision so nearly in harmony with what the Lord had revealed to me. That is, what the other writers of her day had written. She says, I was surprised to find what they had written so nearly in harmony with what the Lord had revealed to me. In another place she says, I was astonished at the things shown me in vision. Many things came directly across my own ideas. James and Ellen White visited Dansville, New York, where Dr. Jackson and Dr. Trawl were holding forth in this water cure institution. We had no medical institution of our own in 1864 when they first visited there, nor in 1865 when she went back with her husband after he'd suffered a stroke. And so they went to the place where they felt they could get the best help, and so they went to this Dansville institution. By the way, Ellen White writes about the fact that Dr. Lay, who was an Adventist, had just joined the staff at the institution, and she says that it was in the Lord's providence. She says, I saw that it was in the Lord's providence that Dr. Lay had joined the staff at Dansville. He was an Adventist physician, but he had an opportunity to go to this other institution to learn how they were putting into practice certain things. And of course, eventually he came back to our own Battle Creek Sanitarium and headed it up for a period of time, was the editor of the Health Reformer magazine, and was instrumental in bringing many of these things in a practical way to the church. But Ellen White, when she visited Dansville twice, both in 1864 and in 1865, did not accept everything she saw there. And I think this is a critical point. As she went to the institution, she saw that there were certain things that were in direct contradiction with what she'd been shown in vision. And I think this is a significant thing to remember as we consider her relationship to those who are around her. We've already mentioned the American costume, the so-called reform dress. Ellen White introduced the reform dress, which was entirely different from the so-called reform dress. And she did it because she objected to some things in this so-called reform dress that was advocated by these non-Adventists at Dansville. She also saw the amusements that were going on at this institution. She said, this is not in harmony with what the Lord has revealed to me, and she rejected them. She also saw that Dr. Trawl's advocacy of no salt, indicating that it was a poison, was not in harmony with what the Lord had revealed to her. In fact, you'll find in Counsels on Diet and Foods 344 a very interesting statement about salt, where Ellen White says, I was shown, and I'm paraphrasing it, that we should use some salt. The whys and wherefores of this I don't understand. Somehow the Lord had shown her, in face of current opinion of her day, that no salt should be used. The Lord had shown her that some should be used. And she said, I don't know why, but that's what He's told me, and that's what I'm telling you. And this was in direct contradiction to Dansville. Another thing that they did at Dansville that certainly Ellen White disagreed with was the idea that there would be no physical labor for invalids. They were to sit around and do nothing. Ellen White said, this contradicts what the Lord has shown me. In fact, this is what led her to take her husband away from there. Because as a result of the teachings of Dansville that her husband should just sit around and do nothing, or he should just play games, you know, chess and checkers. This is, by the way, the setting in which those statements were made. When she saw that this was contrary to what the Lord had revealed to her regarding how her invalid husband should get well, she said, I've got to get him away from here. And it was almost too late. Because as a result of the experience at Dansville, her husband had gotten implanted in his mind, sick as he was, that he should not do anything physically. And some of you may know of her experience of buying a farm up in northern Michigan in Greenville. And there she took him to get him to be physically active again. She bought hoes for herself and her son and her husband, and she said, we want to take these hoes out and hoe the garden, and you come out. When it went to the time for bringing in the hay, why, her husband was going to get the people around the neighborhood to help him with his hay, and she knew that he was going to do this. And so when she went around to these neighbors and she said, now you're very busy, aren't you, with your hay? Yes. Well, when my husband comes around, you tell him you're too busy. Well, he came around and asked for their help, and he came home very discouraged, and he said, I don't understand these people. Nobody wants to help me get the hay in. Well, Ellen White said, let's us do it. That was her purpose. Well, there was another thing that was taught at Dansville that I think is significant that Ellen White disagreed with. And that was the idea that the reason that her husband had become an invalid, or anyone would become an invalid, is that they were too intensely religious. She said, I don't agree with that. God hasn't given that particular picture to me. I think of several comparing statements, and my, there's so much we could say on this subject, but I think we can emphasize perhaps just two or three things. In connection with the experience at Dansville, Ellen White writes this, when Dr. Jackson dwelt upon the subject of health, we were too deeply interested for the good of our wearied minds. For our minds would begin to travel, comparing Dr. J's philosophy with facts established in our minds. Notice, which had been received from higher and unerring authority. There she was, noticing what was being done at Dansville, and she said, it disagrees with what I've been shown. And that was one reason she left the place. Well, there were a lot of things that they were teaching there that she agreed with. Yes, this is true. Yes, I agree with this. But there were some things that no. She said, as I compare it, I have to reject it because it doesn't agree with what the Lord has shown me. She talks further, and this is in Story of Our Health message. You'll find these various statements there, 136, 137. Here's another one. The ideas that are here advanced that we're too intensely religious, and that is the reason why we're invalids, I cannot admit. Page 138 in Story of Our Health message, again, she says, the fact that his illness, talking of her husband's, was the result of overwork together with the instructions of the Dansville physicians concerning the importance of entire rest led him in his feeble state to shrink from all exertion. And of course, then she tells about leaving the institution. One other statement. This comes from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 1, page 489 and 490, and it's in the connection with the Dansville institution. She says, I was shown that those who are strongly fortified with religious principles and are firm to obey all God's requirements cannot receive that benefit from the popular health institutions of the day that others of a different faith can. In other words, what she's saying here is that the Dansville institution had many good things, but she said Adventists ought to develop their own institutions, and that with our own institutions, we cannot get the benefit from these institutions that others who don't know the health message that the Lord has given me can. She went on to say that if Adventists went to these non-Adventist institutions, she says they have to carry along with them at all times the gospel sieve and sift everything they hear that they may choose the good and refuse the bad. This reminds us just briefly of her relationship to this. You know, in regard to Ellen White's work, there are many other things we can consider, but we must conclude. May I just suggest that there's a letter that Ellen White wrote to Jan Andrews that appears in this last week's Review and Herald that I think you all ought to read very carefully. This has just been made available. We only discovered it perhaps just a short time ago, 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, and we made this public and of course have put it in the Review and Herald upon its discovery. But it points to the fact that as we deal with those who are objectors to the truth that we believe, there's a certain balance that's necessary. True, we're to deal with the problems that confront us. True, we're to deal with those who object against what we believe. But there's a point beyond which it's useless to work. And I know that many of you have read this article, and I hope you read it and reread it and save it, because it's a very basic article that I think is helpful in this subject. Ellen White, in writing to Jan Andrews in 1872, said, "If you and other men take a position to investigate and show the fallacy and inconsistency of men who dishonestly turn the truth of God into a lie, Satan will stir up men enough to keep your pen and the pens of several others constantly employed, while other branches of the work are left to suffer." Now notice she says Satan's going to stir up this kind of thing. We have to make very sure that we have answers for those who object to what we believe. But as Ellen White suggests, there is a point beyond which we can go no further. There's also the reminder that Satan is behind objections to what we believe is truth, and that if he could do so, he would keep us so busy dealing with detractors that we wouldn't have time to get the work finished. And I just don't think we have time for that. She says you may remove every prop today and close the mouths of objectors so they can say nothing, and tomorrow they'll go over the very same ground again. How true that is. How true that is. And I'm sure that in response to perhaps some of the things that we may say today, we may find some people who object to some of these things, finding some way to object again. But we believe that God is on the side of the counsel that we have. Was Ellen White a liar? Well, that perhaps is a question that each of us must answer for ourselves. But I'm interested in a couple of very brief sentences that Ellen White herself spoke on this subject, and it seems interesting to perhaps mention them here. In Volume 4 of Testimonies for the Church, page 495, Ellen White says this: "It is better to die than to sin, better to want than to defraud, better to hunger than to lie." Volume 5 of Testimonies for the Church, she says this, page 53, "Those who would rather die than perform a wrong act are the only ones who will be found faithful." I believe she told the truth. We hope that each of you, as you think about the challenge that has been raised to Ellen White's position as a messenger, as a prophet of the Lord, will rather calmly and carefully consider and weigh all of the evidence. We've talked about this a good many times among ourselves, and we feel that the Lord can overrule and will overrule, and that even our detractors perhaps will be used in certain ways to call attention to the truth that might not have been called attention to otherwise. But I think it's important for us each to be reminded that we should know for ourselves what we believe and why we believe it. And perhaps in this experience, it might be a bit used by the Lord to get us back to reading and studying what we should have been doing perhaps more of. We have 2 documents that will be available to deal with the question of this book, and we want to mention them at this time. There'll be a review or a discussion and review of Prophetess of Health, and this is available at the present time. You can get it from our White Estate office here at Andrews University, or you can write to our office in Washington. we placed a small charge of 35 cents on this document. It's about 23 pages in length, large pages. We also plan a more extended critique of the book, and this should be available later in the year, perhaps October or November. For those of you who want to study in more detail some of the things that we've talked about today, would like to further find answers for yourself and perhaps for those who seek answers from you, we would suggest that these two documents will be helpful. Along with this very special book, The Story of Our Health Message by D.E. Robinson. This book, written by a man who spent several years as a secretary to Ellen White, is written by a man who is rather interesting and perhaps unique. As far as we know, it's the only man who ever read everything Ellen White ever wrote. The manuscripts, the letters, the diaries, everything. Those of us in the office, I don't think, have read everything. I know we haven't. But of course, it's there, and it's there for our use. We hope and trust that what we've said today will be of some help to you in answering the questions that have come to you. And if you want further help, I suggest that you go to these three documents: this book, Story of Our Health Message, the discussion and review, and if you further want more detailed material, we'll have a larger critique ready a little bit later in the year.